has been going on over the last few months across the state on this topic. And so the format for today is a little bit different. After hearing OPR staff on the proposed guidelines briefly, we will devote the bulk of our time here together to discuss among a panel of experts on several key issues that have been raised during OPR's outreach over the last few months. So time permitting, after the panel weighs in on each topic, we will invite observers to ask questions on that topic. So you're welcome to just come down and ask questions from the podium.
We have a couple of roving mics.
Oh, okay, yeah. Great, roving mics, even better. So there'll be 3 or 4 broad topics, which I will, stay tuned, I will tell you what they are in a couple minutes. So, but first of all, we chose this format for the workshop for several reasons. First, we wanted to use this forum to discuss a couple of commonly raised issues in depth. Second, we wanted to hear from a multidisciplinary group of experts on these topics and provide the public with an opportunity to ask questions of these experts. Third, we hope to this setup will encourage people to set their talking points down and really help us work through some of the issues presented. And then finally, we hope this workshop will give us a chance to learn from each other about different perspectives on these issues. So before we get started, there's a couple disclaimers to make. While we have assembled a really excellent group of experts here today, the views that you will hear from these individuals are their own, do not necessarily represent the administration or their own organizations. So you're all disclaimed, properly disclaimed. This workshop is an informal proceeding. It is being webcast and recorded, and I also wanted to welcome those who are watching it online, but the comments are not going to be transcribed. We know that we will not get through every issue today, but the best way to submit comments is in writing, which is preferably via email. Is this the correct email? Yes. Okay. So the email is cequa.guidelines@cers.ca.gov. So finally, we also I want to recognize that this panel does not represent every stakeholder on this issue, though it is a pretty good broad spectrum up here. Due to constraints on time and space, we invited a range of panelists that we know have been working on these issues for quite a few years. So with that, I want to introduce our panel, and then I will tell you what the 3 or 4 discussion topics will be for today. So Eric Ruhr, who chairs the Institute for Transportation Engineers, SB743 Task Force. Eric? Do we have Ron Milam here today? Yes, there he is. Ron Milam, I gotta put on my glasses so I can see all the way down there. Ron Milam, Director of Technical Development at Fair & Peers, which is a transportation consulting firm, done a lot of really important work across the state. Victoria Wise, hello, Deputy Director of Environmental Planning with the City and County of San Francisco. She's leading the city's effort to develop a VMT-based transportation impact metric, so welcome from San Francisco. Kurt Johansson, great, I'm glad you made it, Kurt. Hi, nice to see you. Managing General Partner of Sustainable Communities Partners, LLC, and President of the Council of Infill Builders, so bringing an important developer's perspective today, thank you. Jim Moose is right here, partner at Remy Moose Manley Law Firm, and one of the state's leading experts on CEQA, quite relevant. Amanda Eakin, to my right, is Deputy Director of Urban Solutions at NRDC, and was involved during the legislative development of SB743, the birth of this bill. Terry Watt, all the way on the end there, on my right, planner at large and occasional volunteer with OPR. And then, of course, we have Chris Ganson, who's Senior Planner, and Chris Calfee, Senior Counsel at OPR. And then myself. Did I miss anyone? Hey, Jeff, why didn't you make it on here? Jeff Tumlin, who is a principal with Nelson Nygaard Consulting, important transportation company, consulting company, works across the country and the world, actually. So now I'm going to turn over to OPR for a brief presentation, and I'm just going to give those of you in the audience a preview on the 3 topics so you can start thinking about it, what questions you'd like to ask the panelists. The 3 topics that we will definitely get to today, one is regarding the presumption that projects within half-mile of transit would cause less than significant transportation impacts, so that half-mile transit presumption. The second is suggested thresholds of significance. The third is examples of mitigation measures. So those are the 3 topics we're going to get to. If we have time, we will get to safety as well, safety analysis of safety impacts. I am going to pose some questions for our panelists after OPR's presentation, and after each of those 3 topics, I will open up for questions. So we'll have 3 rounds of questions. If we have time, we will get to safety. And then I believe we should plan on wrapping up at 3 o'clock for open questions. So if you have additional questions not related to those, we will take them at 3 o'clock. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to OPR.
Terrific. Thank you, Kate, and thanks everyone for being here today in person and watching in on the internet. I believe that everyone has, you read the email address for comments for folks who aren't in the room today but are out in watching this from afar. I'm going to start off the presentation by providing a little bit of background. Some of the issues that we've seen at OPR and had stakeholders carry to us about the use of automobile level of service standards, or LOS, in CEQA, and some of the benefits that stakeholders have mentioned and that we've seen in replacing that metric with vehicle miles traveled. So to start off, let me work with the technology for a moment here. It seems to have gotten ahead of me. Okay, well, we'll go with it. To start off, infill development has long been an objective of the state of California. We have a number of overarching policies that point us to doing infill development. And yet we have some barriers in some other policy at the state level, including at the state level, that get in the way of doing more infill. So I wanted to start off with a graphical illustration of the implications for infill of using LOS in CEQA. Infill development adds relatively little vehicle travel to the roadway network, and that's because it tends to be centrally located, tends to have access to other modes of transportation. And yet, let's see if the slide comes up. We may be stuck here on the slideshow. Technology people, if you're able to unstick them, that would be helpful. This example is a lot more interesting. There we go. This example is a lot more interesting with the graphical part showing, since it's entirely a graphical example. The infill development tends to trigger numerous LOS impacts, and that's because you add the impact of the project to the existing traffic, and infill by definition is built where there is existing vibrance, existing traffic. It's a last-in development. So you tend to be in areas with already existing traffic and therefore more easily push LOS over thresholds. Yes, there's going to be a little bit of delay in the system, ironically. Okay, greenfield projects, meanwhile, are by definition last in development, and they generate a lot more vehicle travel, frequently 3 or 4 times as much vehicle travel as an infill area in the same region. And yet, when you look at an LOS analysis from one of these projects, you see that they tend to create fewer impacts. And that's because they are the first in development by definition, so they aren't adding to existing traffic. That's not to say that these projects don't have an effect on regional traffic. The traffic generated by these projects is dispersed enough by the time it reaches congested areas that it doesn't tend to trigger LOS thresholds. That's even though it contributes broadly to regional congestion and all that comes along with that. Now it's advancing automatically. So hopefully it won't go too far. Where we are now is in looking at some of the problems with LOS that stakeholders have raised to our office since well before I arrived there in the last several years. And the first is what I just illustrated, a bias against infill development because of the last in problem. A second issue is that the scale of analysis for LOS tends to be small. In other words, it registers impacts near the project but misses the big regional picture. And that's also a problem. The scale of analysis is also a problem insofar as in transportation planning at large, we've replaced the LOS CEQA analysis with other transportation planning because it turns out that improvements to individual intersections and roadway segments don't add up to optimizing the corridor or network. It's actually even possible when expanding the capacity of an intersection to worsen overall conditions by making for worse congestion downstream. A third issue raised by stakeholders is that LOS mitigation is itself problematic. Essentially, there's two options when mitigating LOS. One is to reduce the size of the project, but that simply moves the development to other locations, and if you were in a good location to begin with, it moves it to a worse location. Your other option is to widen roads or increase capacity, and that tends to induce additional vehicle travel, lengthen pedestrian crossing distances, and therefore add to risk for pedestrians, and displace space where bicycle facilities might have gone. A fourth issue raised by stakeholders, the LOS mischaracterizes transit, biking, and walking as detriments to transportation rather than transportation in their own right. An example of this is a transit priority lane, maybe for a bus rapid transit system, which increases the person throughput of a corridor. But LOS sees vehicles and so sees an impact when fewer vehicles can travel the corridor. Similarly, LOS characterizes pedestrians and cyclists as obstructions to cars to be channeled and restricted. A fifth issue, that there is a well-developed methodology for estimating future LOS, but it isn't necessarily terribly accurate. And that's inherent in the problem. It's very difficult to figure out from a project where the traffic will go in technical terms, trip distribution, the route the traffic will take. But that's very important to determining LOS because in order to determine LOS, you need to know the volumes at each intersection and along each roadway segment. Because that's difficult to determine, and because determining LOS or the delay associated with LOS is sensitive to the volume going through, you essentially, in calculating LOS, have an uncertain number fed into a model that requires precision. So it's inherently not too accurate. And yet, of course, we often see it shared as a number to a few decimal places, and sometimes that gives a false sense of precision. Another issue raised is that the use of delay-based metrics in the big picture is problematic for where we're going as a state, namely looking to do more infill development. A couple other regions, Portland and Denver, Denver illustrated here, have done a lot of infill development over the recent decades, and they've discovered that delay goes up substantially, and that's not terribly unexpected if you add more destinations and more trip generators to the urban fabric. You're going to have more traffic, and that's going to cause more delay. But additional destinations also means that shorter trip distances, and those have tended to actually outweigh the delay. And so in those areas, you can get places you want to go even a little bit more quickly than you could before. Yet delay, looking at a delay metric, you'd think that they were doing very badly for transportation. And this is important to the state of California because we have SB743 and an infill priority law, and we intend to accomplish a lot of our environmental and, for that matter, transportation and making our cities vibrant, et cetera, by doing more infill development. And if we have a metric that's pushing in the opposite direction, that can be a problem. A last issue that I'll speak of here that was raised by stakeholders is that LOS pushes us to build roads that we can't afford to maintain. Few jurisdictions in the state have programmed sufficient monies to fund their existing pavement maintenance, and LOS compels the addition of additional pavements and therefore additional maintenance burden. So we've had a number of discussions of in what parts of the state this issue pertains. And as we look, we see that not only in central cities, but in suburban areas across rural areas, really in locations across the state, these problems with LOS are present. The delays come back. Okay. So starting about a year ago, we reached out to a number of experts, including the folks here and a lot of others, to ask what metric would be a good replacement for LOS. A long story short, after talking to experts, putting out a preliminary evaluation listing a number of possible alternative metrics, there was, I wouldn't call it consensus, but a broad majority that vehicle miles traveled was the best replacement metric. And that's for a number of reasons. First, it's easier to model than LOS. We've seen in the case studies we've looked at that have listed how long the LOS analysis would take for the project versus how long a VMT analysis would take. We see factors of a fifth to a 20th the amount of time needed to do a VMT analysis compared to an LOS analysis. There are a number of existing models. Many of them are in regular use, and some of those are in use in CEQA calculating greenhouse gas emissions, which are required today. So essentially, this is a metric we're already using in environmental impact reports today, required to use really as a stepstone to get to GHGs. As I described earlier, LOS is more accurate and it also captures the full extent of vehicle travel rather than just what's going on around the project. It doesn't have the problem that LOS does of inducing additional travel with some of the mitigation, so it doesn't undo itself in its effort to reduce congestion, to eliminate congestion. VMT doesn't have this problem that LOS does. Also, VMT mitigation broadly forwards other environmental and human health objectives, and it's consistent with a broad array of other goals, including, as I mentioned, fiscal health. So I'll add also that we've looked at the whether these benefits are available from VMT reduction, whether benefits of VMT reduction are available just in central urban areas, and also or whether they're available in the rest of the state as well. And the answer, in short, has been that they're available in all locations. That statewide VMT reduction would create these benefits, and also that there are mitigation measures available for project types in all parts of the state. In fact, in suburban areas, to give an example, the VMT is often high to begin with. So though central cities may have more tools in their tool belt to reduce VMT, the total amount of VMT reduction available may be greater in those outlying jurisdictions. So with that background and a look at the problems with LOS and the benefits of using VMT in the CEQA context, I'm going to hand the floor over to Chris Calfee. He's going to talk about the statute itself, SB743, and our preliminary draft guidelines that we've worked on and put out and are currently out for public comment.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Kate, for that introduction. Before launching into what the statute says, I wanted to make a couple of observations. The first observation I would make is despite LOS being very familiar, I would say that it has not been in CEQA forever. The first mention that I could find linking level of service to CEQA came in the congestion management statutes, which were added in the late 80s. They were added explicitly to the CEQA guidelines in Appendix G in the late 90s. But as early as 2002, the legislature recognized that there were problems with using level of service, and it caused problems in particular for infill development. So the issue has been swirling around for a long time, and Chris mentioned that it's been coming to OPR's attention for a number of years. That's when it first came to my attention. I was working with OPR on an update to the CEQA guidelines addressing greenhouse gas emissions, and at that time, a number of stakeholder groups came to OPR suggesting that we remove level of service and replace it with vehicle miles traveled. In fact, some of those folks are on this dais today, and some of you may be out in the audience as well. But at that time, it didn't seem that we had clear enough statutory authority to make that type of a change, although that changed drastically with the passage of SB743. Another observation I would make about 743 in particular is that it arose at a time of heightened expectations about CEQA reform and changes to CEQA. Now, 743, in my view, is not that. It is surgical. It does make some very targeted improvements, specifically around infill development and transportation impacts. Now, there are some out there among us who feel that incremental reform is actually worse than nothing at all, because that may take away the energy that might support a broader CEQA reform. On the other hand, we have stakeholders out there who see any changes to CEQA as a very big deal and something very threatening. Speaking for myself, I don't fall into either one of those camps. I actually see SB743 as giving us the potential to rationalize our planning and our environmental review. And I see a potential for beneficial outcomes in the environmental community, in the business community, and amongst lead agencies and other agencies. So let's talk about why I think there's room for hope here. So SB743, it was passed last year at the end of session, and a couple of things stand out to me about SB743. The first thing is, if you look in the intent language, the legislature stated very clearly that we needed a change in the way that we analyze transportation impacts under CEQA. And in particular, the legislature was calling for CEQA to align better with other state policies. And it identified in particular SB375 and greenhouse gas reductions that we would get from better aligning transportation and land use planning. And secondly, the legislature pointed to the Complete Streets Act, which called for making our roadways available to all users of the roads, including motorists, bicyclists, pedestrians, and transit users. Another thing that stands out about 743 is it says very clearly that auto delay, standing by itself, will not be considered a significant environmental impact. While we've treated it that way in practice for a number of years, the legislature has spoken that delay by itself is not a significant environmental impact. Instead, the legislature called on the Office of Planning and Research and the Natural Resources Agency to update the CEQA guidelines to replace level of service with a different measure of transportation impacts. It said that we must come up with this replacement within transit areas, but we have discretion to go much further, to go statewide if appropriate. In developing those alternative metrics, the legislature told us to come up with something that promoted the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, promoted infill development, and promoted multimodal transportation networks. In fact, the legislature gave us a couple of suggested metrics, including vehicle miles traveled, auto trips generated, and a couple of variations on that. Once the new CEQA guidelines are adopted, then auto delay will not be considered a significant environmental impact. Now, the legislature took auto delay off the table, but it was explicit in leaving on the table a couple of transportation-related impacts. And so it said that air quality and noise and safety are still potentially relevant CEQA considerations. The other thing that 743 left on the table was local government's police power. So we know that cities and counties across the state have level of service requirements in their general plans, in their zoning codes, in their fee programs. All of those remain in place. What we do in the CEQA guidelines will just alter how we evaluate environmental impacts of transportation in CEQA. And finally, one last thing I want to point out about 743 is it required that we act with haste. We were required to come up with a first draft of these guidelines by summer of this year, which to me indicates that the legislature is calling on us to move forward quickly. So we did that. In August of this year, we did release a preliminary discussion draft of changes to the CEQA guidelines. And I want to emphasize that this really is a preliminary discussion draft. These are big changes, and we know that we need to hear from all stakeholders about what we do. But we had to start somewhere, and so this is our starting point. The proposal contains a number of pieces. First, consistent with the statute, it does say that auto delay is not to be considered an environmental impact under CEQA. Instead, it points to vehicle miles traveled as the primary metric for analyzing transportation impacts. Chris Ganson already ran through the many reasons that we chose vehicle miles traveled. If you'd like to see additional information, we published a report at the end of December of last year that described in detail our impressions of the other possible metrics. The statute did not authorize OPR to set thresholds of significance, but it did tell OPR to give guidance to lead agencies on determining the significance of impacts. And so we did that in a couple of different ways. First, we break out in the proposal how you might evaluate impacts from land use projects and how you might evaluate impacts from transportation projects. And in each, we attempt to give examples of considerations that may lead to a significant impact versus a less than significant impact. On the land use side, the proposal says that if you're a land use project that locates within 1/2 mile of transit, then the guidelines presume that your impact is less than significant. What that means is that in most cases, if you are a land use project that locates within 1/2 mile of transit, you wouldn't be doing any kind of transportation study and you wouldn't be asking for mitigation measures. The other way to show that you're a less than significant impact is if you do a transportation study and you can demonstrate that your project will reduce area-wide VMT. So in other words, if you're a commercial project and you locate within a primarily residential area, and by locating there you allow people to drive a smaller distance, that might be treated as a less than significant impact. On the other hand, if you're a land use project that would generate greater than regional average VMT, the proposal suggests that that might be treated as a significant impact. And by regional, we're referring to the Metropolitan Planning Organization area. So in this area, it's SACOG, the 6-county region. In the Bay Area, it's the 9-county MTC area. And the average is measured against the project type. So if it's a residential project, you'd be asking, is it greater than average per capita VMT? If it's an employment center project, it would be per employee, et cetera. The proposal, as I mentioned, the statute says that safety remains on the table for CEQA impacts. We've noticed that safety is evaluated in different ways in different parts of the state. So what we attempted to do in the proposal is identify some objective factors that might give rise to a safety impact. And those things include increasing potential conflict areas between motorists and bicyclists and pedestrians, increasing queue lengths on freeway off-ramps, and a couple of others. The proposal also identifies a number of, I blew way past potential impacts from transportation impacts. For transportation impacts, the proposal says if you're an active transportation project, like a pedestrian project or a bicycle plan, or if you're a transit project, all of those things would tend to reduce vehicle miles traveled. So we presume that those are less than significant. On the other hand, if your project involves adding a general purpose lane in a congested area, that might tend to encourage more people to drive, and that would be treated as a significant impact. If things are just managed lanes, if it's just operational or safety improvements, those would not be treated as a significant impact. But let me fast forward again to mitigation measures. Our proposal lists examples of mitigation measures that might reduce vehicle miles traveled, and those mitigation measures were drawn from a report that was developed by the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association. This is their guide to quantifying greenhouse gas reductions. And that guide was based on peer-reviewed literature that showed how you could actually quantify emissions reductions. We drew from the section on transportation emissions. But I want to emphasize that those are examples only. We propose to add that list of examples in Appendix F, which addresses energy impacts and includes other examples of energy-reducing measures. The proposal also includes a section on methodology, and this is something, any attorneys in the room? I know a couple are out there, okay. This is something you may want to pay attention to. When I was in private practice and when I was called to defend transportation studies, I found it very frustrating because a lot of transportation studies were based on assumptions that didn't find their way into the administrative record. And if they don't find their way into the administrative record, you get into a lot of trouble. Also, I found myself getting into fights about why you chose to analyze this intersection and not the intersection right next to it. With those difficulties in mind, we crafted this section in the proposal that does a couple of things. First, it says that the entire analysis is subject to a rule of reason. And what I mean by that is we're asking you to do your very best effort, but we're not asking for perfection. So no study will be asking you to trace down every last mile that a project occupant might travel. Additionally, the section on methodology says, number one, we expect that lead agencies likely will use models to do an analysis of VMT, and lead agencies have discretion to pick which model is most appropriate for the project. The other thing that the section does is say it's appropriate to use your professional judgment in modifying the inputs and outputs of the model. So you might want to use different trip generation numbers than come out of the ITE handbook. You might want to make different assumptions about trip lengths based on your locality. Those are all appropriate under this proposal, provided that you explain what you're doing in the administrative record. With regard to applicability, this proposal, once adopted, it would apply in stages. So first of all, the proposal would only apply prospectively. It wouldn't trap projects that are already in process. It would only apply to new projects that are going forward with their environmental review. Second, we propose a phased-in approach where the proposal would apply immediately within transit-rich areas, and outside of those areas, lead agencies could opt in if they want to go under the new system. But after a certain period of time, then it would apply statewide. And the date you see in the proposal is January 1, 2016. We recognize that that's, first of all, a placeholder, and given where we are in the rulemaking process right now, that's probably too quick. So I would imagine that that date may change. The other things that you'll find in our proposal, which is on OPR's website, is a number of appendices and explanatory materials. So we list out, for example, the different models that we're aware of that can be used to estimate VMT. We've listed out some possible mitigation measures. We've attempted to describe how you might methodologically do the VMT analysis, and we also have a frequently asked questions document. So next steps, we're continuing to do outreach just like this and a number of venues throughout the state, but we've asked for all comments to be submitted by November 21. After that time, we will review all of the comments that come in and decide what changes, if any, might be appropriate to make to the proposal. Given the amount of input that we've had from folks so far, I would expect to see some changes. If those changes are significant, then we'll likely send out the proposal for an additional round of public review. But once we get it to a point where we're comfortable with the proposal, we'll ship it over to the Natural Resources Agency, which then commences a formal rulemaking process. So I'm expecting that we won't come to resolution on this until sometime in 2015. So we've reached the end of our presentation and can move into the panel discussion.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Thank you to OPR for your leadership on this important law. I know that we've been spending a lot of time together over at Caltrans every other week with a technical team trying to tackle this, how to implement this law as it evolves, so, and the regulations. So thank you for all of that. So I'm going to open up to the panel with the first issue, and then we've got about an hour for panel discussion, and then also a little after 3, I'd like to open up for general questions. I also would welcome specific questions on each specific topic from the audience as well. So we have 3 topics. We're going to start with the presumption that projects within half-mile transit would cause less than significant transportation impacts. So if you have in the audience some specific questions around that topic, I will gladly open it up in a few minutes. But I wanted to first open up to our panel Would anyone like to take that first question? Terry?
Oh, yeah, I'm already going to change it up. Okay, so as somebody who had some input on how we ran this, I think it's really important because we probably have people in the audience and listening in who see us diving into some very technical issues. And we're diving into those very technical issues because I think I, for one, believe we are on a good course here for two reasons. One, I don't think me sitting in traffic is an environmental impact. And two, if I don't think me sitting in traffic is an environmental impact, I think we ought to think about how to apply this statewide. And three, just to frame it up, what we are doing now I don't think is particularly working. And as it cross purposes with the other state and many regional and local goals for reductions in greenhouse gases and frankly improved livability of our communities. So maybe before we start, Kate, I would suggest perhaps just a really quick run down the line for each of us to sort of say why we're here. I think we're all up here on the panel because we've drunk the Kool-Aid, we're on the right path. We need to get constructive, roll up our sleeves, and figure out what the best guidelines there is. And I know people in the audience may not necessarily agree with everything I've said, but I wanted you at least to know where we're coming from.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, you feel free to pass, but if any you want to make some opening remarks, sure.
Okay. So my name is Jeff Tumlin. I'm with Nelson Nygaard Transportation Planning. And I am here because there is a direct contradiction between the work that we as consultants have to do in the transportation analysis section of a CEQA document and what's going on in every other section of a CEQA document, particularly air quality. What we find is that if the assumption under a level of service model is that we first need to look at what is the worst case scenario in terms of automobile trip generation that a project might generate, and then identify ways of mitigating that worst case scenario of automobile trip generation rate by accommodating the worst case scenario. The result of that is, it is our mitigations that are creating our traffic problem and not development itself. Because it is always better to widen a road under the current methodology of CEQA. And in fact, it's perfectly fine for me to widen that road by narrowing the sidewalk, by eliminating crosswalks, by eliminating bike lanes, and making it that much more difficult to walk or bike or to take transit. So our task here, I think, is twofold, and our challenge is twofold. The first is, how do we reduce harm? How do we eliminate this contradiction between the transportation analysis section and environmental concerns by reducing the burden that infill development faces and making it easier to do the kind of development that not only benefits the environment of California, but also an array of other public goods such as public health, reduced regional traffic congestion, improved social equity, and so on. So there is firstly the how do we stop the current harm that CEQA is creating. But then there's the second and the more challenging question, which is how do we use the transportation analysis section of CEQA for public good? And is CEQA the right tool for doing that? How do we address the inherent limitations of CEQA, which is merely a legal disclosure instrument rather than a good planning tool? And I think much of the debate that we will be having on the panel this afternoon rests in that what is CEQA for question.
Eric Rohr, representing the Institute of Transportation Engineers. The reason that I'm here and the reason that the Institute of Transportation Engineers is interested in this issue is that we are the typical authors of CEQA transportation documents, and so we are interested in creating guidelines and helping to craft guidelines that will actually work and are practical and that we can use and explain to decision makers. And so we're interested in getting into the details of this. How is it going to work? You know, what level of guidance should be statewide? What level of guidance should be done at the local level? And doing case studies to look at what might go right and what might go wrong in this process.
Thanks.
Ron Milam with Fair and Peers. As a transportation consultant, one of our roles is to help advise cities, counties, other lead agencies in terms of transportation impact analysis with regards to CEQA. So in the development of new guidance, it's important for us to kind of be at the table to share some of our technical expertise, and also to help identify some of the consequences, as Eric pointed out, understanding some case study applications to help guide how the development of this particular set of technical guidance will evolve.
Victoria Wise, Deputy Environmental Review Officer for the City of San Francisco with the Planning Department. We are the lead agency in CEQA documents, and so this is of direct relevance to us, very much so. But I'm really here today because, as Terry mentioned and other people have mentioned, level of service does not work in many respects that we've talked about previously, so I won't harp on that. We in San Francisco are really trying to figure out how to assess new developments' impacts on the transportation system under CEQA to make sure that we can take all the infill development that we need to be able to take, but at the same time preserve the kind of mobility that the city needs to have in order to have a livable city. And how do we do that? There are many ways, but one of them could be through CEQA, and so I'm here to talk about how to make that happen.
Great, thank you. Kurt?
Thank you, Kate. Kurt Johansson. I am board president of the Council of Infill Builders. I'm also a development practitioner. Our organization is very interested in promoting infill. We have a number of statewide developers very successful at mixed-use infill projects. Where I'm particularly interested in this panel, not only on behalf of the Council of Infill Builders and promoting better ways to make infill easier to do for the development community, but also as a practitioner, I am actually trying to develop a mixed-use infill in parts of California that are not yet served by transit, and I'm very concerned about inclusivity for all parts of the state when it comes to transportation planning.
Great. Jim?
Hi, Jim Moose, Ramey Moose Manley. I'm not sure whether drinking the Kool-Aid was a prerequisite to being invited. I think I've drunk some of the Kool-Aid. I'm not sure I'm completely transformed by it. And I suspect I might have been invited in part to play the Snidely Whiplash role of development lawyer, because I don't see anyone else filling that role. I do have a developer here, but he's very politically correct because he actually builds infill projects. He's not a sprawl guy. So maybe I'm expected to channel some of those thoughts, and I'll try to do that in good taste from time to time. I guess my general thought is I think this is good public policy insofar as I do think that an obsession with level of service under CEQA is counterproductive in some instances. Obviously, widening roads can harm the very environmental resources that CEQA otherwise would be protecting. So if your biology chapter says, watch out for the vegetation, watch out for the wetlands, and your traffic chapter says, wipe out those wetlands by adding more lanes, those are cross purposes. I also think that in particular, infill development is frustrated by an obsession with level of service because it's just the nature of a thriving metropolitan area like downtown San Francisco, that it's going to be kind of like New York, where it's hard to get around in a car, and there's a lot of societal benefits from having communities like that, and one of those would be per capita VMT would go down. I guess my only hesitation about some of this is that I think there's a danger that we might be getting rid of something the public actually cares about, which is level of service. During the course of my career, going back to the mid-1980s, I've observed a number of growth control measures around the state that seem to be driven by level of service. So if you talk to people out in the public and ask them, what do you care about in terms of environmental effects, traffic is at the top of a lot of people's lists. So there's a danger that those of us up here who are very focused on greenhouse gas emissions and that sort of thing might get out too far ahead of the public from a political standpoint, and there's a danger of mending CEQA in a way that takes away what they care most about. I think another potential negative would be over the last 10 years or so, I've been able to use the threat of CEQA litigation to motivate a lot of my developer clients to make deals with other jurisdictions, to try to facilitate regional coordination for transportation planning, cost sharing for infrastructure that benefits multiple jurisdictions. And it is the threat of CEQA litigation that motivates them in a lot of instances. And if LOS is no longer a CEQA issue, then there won't be the fear factor for a lot of developers, I think, to decide that they're going to willingly go work with other jurisdictions to try to make sure that there's a smooth flow of people and goods on the road system. And the final thing I would say is that I think there's some skepticism about this in rural communities. And I happen to represent one or more rural counties. And I've visited them, and I've seen the headquarters for the State of Jefferson movement in some of them. And they would look at this, a lot of those folks would look at this as an exercise by urban liberal elites to try to impose, sort of a UN takeover lifestyle on their communities and make them live in towns when they want to live spread out across the landscape in their ranches and that sort of thing. So I'm a little skeptical about taking this to the rural areas, and hopeful maybe there can be some further thinking about making the rules a little bit different in big urban areas where we really want to have a lot of concentrated development, maybe not apply the same rules in the rural areas.
Okay, Minda?
Okay, I hope you flagged all those issues for discussion later on, though. Certainly provocative. My name is Amanda Eakin with Natural Resources Defense Council. The reason I'm here is NRDC sponsored legislation 2008, SB743. Maybe some of you have heard of it. First in the nation to connect greenhouse gases, land use, and transportation. And we've now spent 6 years in partnership with cities, counties, MPOs around the state, figuring out what are the best strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by reducing VMT through regional plans. And what have we figured out works? We've talked about investing in bicycle infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure. We talked about investing in transit. We talked about infill development and transit-oriented development. So the reason I'm here is that the way CEQA was set up was it made all those things that we've all realized are great at reducing greenhouse gas emissions harder to do, and things that increase greenhouse gas emissions easier to do. And Chris did a great job explaining that from the outset. So we want to align the way CEQA works with successful implementation of SB375. And in fact, the timing is really perfect for this change, because we've spent a lot of time planning. All the regions now have adopted plans. Now we need to implement those plans, so we need to change the rules under CEQA so we can actually effectively implement those plans and all those strategies to reduce VMT.
Great, thank you, everyone. There was a bunch of different issues that were also just brought up. I wanted to focus us on the 3 issues I mentioned at the beginning and dive into those a little deeper. So the first one is about presumption of less than significant impact. So the proposal presumes that projects within half a mile of transit would have a less than significant impact. And so my question for the panel is, are there other factors that should give rise to the same presumption? Other ways we should be thinking about that? That's how it's currently drafted. Half a mile is presumed less than significant. And I'm going to open it up to, let's see, Kurt, Ron, Jim, Victoria, you all had thoughts on this in the pre. Somebody like to jump in? Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, so I think an additional layer that you'd want to add on to this is that the project would have to also be consistent with the sustainable community strategy. If you just allow just any project that locates in the right space to be cleared, you're ignoring the potential that a project could come in less dense than what the SCS has called for, and therefore jeopardize the VMT and greenhouse gas reduction goals of that SCS. So that would just be one of the reasons why an extra layer of checking the project consistency may be a good idea. There's also other requirements within CEQA, whether it's under the air quality or greenhouse gas sections, that consistency with the SCS be done or be checked.
Okay. Anybody else? Go ahead. Yeah. Kurt?
Sure, I can go. So just to tack on to a potential issue that can arise with that, and maybe I can root that in a very specific example that I can think of that's happened in San Francisco, where a project can come in that really meets the criteria but is not particularly transportation efficient, and basically would, if you would, get a free pass. And I think we're quite concerned about that. And I think there are many different aspects that affect the mode split and by extension the VMT of a project, so that density, diversity of uses, design, all of the Ds that people are familiar with really affect your mode split, not just your proximity to transit. But if we were to focus on transit too, I think there are aspects of transit that are important that have to do with reliability of transit, or where does the transit go, not just its headway of 2 lines of, let's say, 15-minute headway during AM and PM. And then the other thing I'd mention is also something that's rooted in reality, and that is sometimes our transportation agencies go through what's called fiscal emergency. There's actually a statutory exemption for this very thing in CEQA, where they cut service. And if you have a project that's located at 2 cross lines that are just on that cusp, that are providing service at 15-minute headways, and the agency cuts service, what then?
Eric, I think you had.
Yeah, I wanted to address this one. I don't think I have a problem with the basic concept of presumption of less than significant impact within 1/2 mile of a major transit stop. I really hesitate to make it more complicated than that. Even this definition of 1/2 mile, within 1/2 mile of a transit stop, has problems of what kind of transit do you have to have? Is it existing transit, future transit, funded transit? So I would really hesitate to make it more complicated unless you can clearly define the objective and clearly know what you're defining.
Okay, Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually one of the question you didn't ask is a really interesting question, and that is, should we be giving a presumption of lessening significance to projects based on the single factor that they are proximate to transit? And certainly, I think we agree with Victoria that there are many factors that influence, and I think we could all conjure projects that are overparked, that have no orientation to the transit, that are not walkable, and that by virtue of those factors really will have, and maybe it's a regional trip generator, by virtue of those factors might have very significant transportation impact. So we're actually quite uncomfortable with the idea that just based on one single factor, we would presume less than significance. So at a minimum, we would want to add in an examination of the amount of parking provided by the project, as well as ideally you'd look at density, diversity, and some measure of job access from those projects. Now, I recognize there's a tension here. We're trying to make this a simple, predictable process, but we also want to make sure these projects are actually going to be reducing VMT. And maybe some of you have seen some literature coming out of UC Berkeley, TOD without the T, where the finding is in fact that it is the transit in combination with a number of other factors that critically results in the VMT. But if you take away the good parking management, if you take away some of those other factors, the rail transit itself is actually not correlated with very much reduction in VMT. So I think we need to look at a number of factors if we want to be confident these are going to be the projects to actually reduce VMT.
Yeah, Jeff.
And I would agree with everything that's been said here. I go back to my original core question, though, which is about to what degree should CEQA be the tool for achieving these objectives, or, for example, the general plan guidance that the state issues. If there's going to be an assumption built into CEQA of requirements for getting out of the transportation analysis, looking at the primary factors that impact VMT, which include location, kind of proximity to transit, project density, and as Amanda just said, how much parking is being provided, as well as not just being near transit, but being near frequent transit, regardless of the mode of that transit. Those would be sort of the easiest to predict metrics that have the most profound outcome on the VMT objective.
Anybody else on this? Sure, I'll jump in. Yeah.
I'll jump in here. I want to start out by reading the language that we're talking about, just in case people don't have in front of them. And here it is. It says, development projects that locate within 1/2 mile of either an existing major transit stop or a stop along an existing high-quality transit corridor generally may be considered to have a less than significant transportation impact. So Chris has characterized that as creating a presumption. I do have a question for you, Chris, and that is whether you use that term in what I would call sort of the legislative history of this, because just looking at it in isolation, I'm not certain a court would find a presumption there. I think if you changed the may to shall, then you would have an irrebuttable presumption that the impact's less than significant. I'm not sure whether may creates a rebuttable presumption. On the other hand, if you had all this background material saying that's what you're trying to do, then I would waive that in front of a judge and say this is what they intended, therefore look at the words on the page in light of the intent. But the way it's written right now, it seems to me it's certainly not an irrebuttable presumption.
Knowing Chris, I'm sure there was a thought about every word. So
yeah, and also I want to just call your attention to, and I'm not sure what your intent here is, the term development project is the subject of much judicial attention back in the 90s on school impact fee cases, where there's a distinction between legislative actions and adjudicatory actions, and the Permit Streamlining Act case law defines this term to be limited just to adjudicatory actions. So if the intent here is to so limit it, then people could construe it that way. But if the intent is not, you might want to define the term. Now, to answer the actual question, I personally like the idea of relaxing the fair argument standard for infill projects. I would agree with people here who suggested that this one factor, proximity to transit, is probably not enough if the reason for doing this is that these projects are supposed to facilitate the use of transit. I'm not sure what additional factors would be best to include. I do think they ought to be relatively simple. Consistency with an SCS seems like it might be one. Density might be another. Mixed use, for the sake of argument, might be something else you'd throw into it. But in general, I think a lot of my developer clients over the years have actually found it easier to do large greenfield development than to do targeted small infill development. In terms of their pro forma, if they're looking at $500,000 to $1 million in litigation costs, and you put that on top of a 10-unit infill project, it's a lot more of a hit on your profitability and possibly would eliminate your profitability, whereas you could put that on top of a 5,000 unit specific plan and it's not much money. So to the extent that this could help result in fewer EIRs for these sorts of projects that we want to incentivize, I think that's a good outcome.
Great. I'm going to let Chris answer the may versus shall question. I also wanted to just give heads up, if you have questions or specifically on this this issue of the half mile of transit significant impact, we've got a microphone right here, and I'd welcome any questions or comments specifically on that. Yeah.
Thanks, Jim, for raising that issue. Kate is correct. Every word was carefully chosen, although I'll admit that it was hastily drafted, so I'm sure it could be drafted better. But at least as I read the statute, and as I read CBE versus resources, which was a case about almost over a decade now, that invalidated a number of prior CEQA guidelines updates, we have to act within certain bounds. And so I don't believe that we can create, and I welcome people to give me authority to the contrary, but as I'm reading the law, I don't think we can create an irrebuttable presumption. I think the best we can do at this point is create a rebuttable presumption. I think as a practical matter that may help out the processing of applications, but as a legal matter, I don't think that reverses the standard of review.
Okay. Any questions or comments on this issue of the half mile of transit being less than a significant impact from the audience? Okay. Yes, go ahead, Kurt.
Thank you, Kate. Jim, you're absolutely right. Developers need all the help they can get, especially with infill. But I do want to just throw this out for the panel because this is a real world example of what's happening. So we are trying to do a project. It is a mixed use infill project. It's diverse, 5 different product types, so it's very unusual for a small city of 25,000 people. They've never seen a project like this. It's walkable. It's a dense community. It's got commercial, it's got residential, it's got lots of different things going on. It's very walkable, and it has a transit center. So we are building in and partnering with the Fresno County Rural Transit Agency to actually create transit within this project. We are being required to do a 138-page traffic study. So my question is, if we set some sort of, and I know further into this we will talk about standards and all that, but if developers could be incentivized to do these kinds of projects, could they get some relief under CEQA that way? And I think that would move more developers towards trying to do this.
Thank you, Kurt. It's very important that you're on this panel from moving the infill developers' perspective. I think I'm going to move us to the next set of issues so we can keep going here. Kurt just mentioned it, but thresholds. So OPR's proposal doesn't set a threshold, but it suggests what might be significant. So the question is, for the panel and also for the audience, is a suggested threshold helpful? And if identifying a potential threshold in the guidelines is helpful, who should do it? Should it be OPR, the regions, individual lead agencies? So on the issue of thresholds, would anyone like to jump in, panelists? Ron?
Okay, this is one of the fun ones. Anytime you're developing a threshold, you're having to make a decision as to what constitutes, in this case, acceptable versus unacceptable VMT. When we're developing thresholds for cities and counties, for example, as part of their general plan, that's a kind of a fundamental question we deal with. And we have to also deal with the trade-offs of drawing that particular line with other community values. So in this case, if we treated this particular threshold or this threshold guidance the same way, we'd want to make sure we have a foundation for where you're drawing the line. And with the legislative intent with 743, I think it's clear that there was a connection to both AB 32 and SB 375, and I think it's important to reflect on what the legislature did with those two laws. 32, we basically said that, greenhouse gas reduction is important to the state, but SB 375 was used to determine, what that meant from the mobile emission side as it relates to land use and transportation questions. And we even went further with 375 and delegated that responsibility down to the regions. So the state's not drawing the specific threshold targets here. We're leaving that up to the regions. So 743 comes along and suggests that that connection is very important. It also suggests the connection to the Complete Streets Act is another important factor. So if we looked at those as the foundation here, then it would suggest that our threshold of acceptable or unacceptable VMT also be connected back to those previous laws. So to the extent that 375 has set greenhouse gas / VMT targets, that would be a potential way to draw the line as to what's acceptable or unacceptable. I also think in addition to SES consistency, we want to think about general plan consistency, especially general plans adopted after January 2011 when the Complete Streets policy kicked in. That's another way to ensure that we're complying with these previous laws and building on that legislative intent over time. So when we look at a threshold, whether it's the one comparing development projects to regional averages or getting into some of the transportation projects, I think it'll be helpful if we can make it very clear as to what the foundation for those thresholds are. And I think given the legislative intent, it was pretty clear that AB 32 and SB 375, as well as the Complete Streets Act, were all part of that. Specifying the regional average has some logical intent behind it, but if that regional average is based on the regional average today, it somewhat disconnects from the SES. The future regional average of the SES may be more appropriate, but I think those are some of the questions that we've been spending some time thinking about, and I think it's worthwhile for this panel and the public to weigh in on those particular questions.
Great. Jeff?
So I agree with Ron, and what I would argue is that in order for California to meet its greenhouse reduction targets that were laid out in AB 32, VMT reduction has to play an important role. So vehicle fuel mix, vehicle efficiency will absolutely play important roles, but in order to reach that target, we really have no choice but to also get some fairly significant VMT reduction. What I worry is that the California Air Resources Board hasn't been very clear in exactly what component of our VMT reduction goal needs to be delegated to new development. If we had such a threshold that was adopted by the Air Resources Board, it would be very easy to establish a threshold in CEQA for new development. Figure out exactly, is the new development helping us meet our CO2 reduction goal that has been attributed to VMT reduction in new development or not. And ideally, the Air Resources Board would delegate to the regions about how those thresholds get set for local communities. Because obviously, a project in Amador County is going to have a lot less of a VMT reduction burden than a project in San Francisco County. What I haven't been able to figure out is how do we get to thresholds without clarity of guidance from the Air Resources Board, and maybe there are others who could help with that.
Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
We're also struggling with the thresholds and trying to figure out how they would work. And the current suggestion from OPR in the draft guidelines, we don't think it works yet. We don't see a path from those guidelines to actual CEQA transportation studies with thresholds that make sense. We're trying to get there by doing case studies and working with folks to develop some of the details. So that is one sort of question: is how do we get this to work in the real world? We're sort of talking about generalities on this panel, and we at ITE we want to get into the details of how's this going to work on specific projects. The other thing that I would question on this is with respect to thresholds is whatever thresholds we set up, what statement are we making about projects that don't meet the threshold? So in other words, they have a significant VMT impact, and can they mitigate it, can they not? If they cannot mitigate it, what statement are we making about those projects? Are we saying that those projects shouldn't be built? Are we saying those projects should write an EIR and then override their significant VMT impacts? I think there are a lot of people concerned about the fact that many of their projects, if they're in a rural or suburban area, are going to have significant VMT impacts, and where are those projects going to end up after that significance is determined?
Eric, on your first point, who do you think should be setting the thresholds? I mean, you said you're looking for more guidance on this, and you don't see it yet in the guidelines, which is kind of true. We kind of so far the guidelines have said it's really up to the lead agencies to set thresholds.
I think that this threshold problem is one that it's a transportation engineering issue, it's an environmental planning issue, and it's a CEQA attorney issue. And so I think that there's only so far that each group can go in answering this question. So I would like to see a panel of experts discuss this and get into the details. So if I have a transportation engineering answer that I think would work, I feel like I need to talk to a CEQA attorney and an environmental planner and say, does this work from your point of view? And when all those parties agree, and perhaps people on both sides, all sides of the issue agree, then I think we have something we can work with.
Any other thoughts on thresholds, Ron? Yeah, and then Amanda?
Let me just kind of add to what Eric's saying that I think will help maybe with the thought process here. So in some respects, regional agencies that develop regional transportation plans and sustainable community strategies, as well as cities and counties that develop general plans, they already have a VMT threshold. It's baked into the plans they've created. Every general plan, every RTP has an allowed amount of VMT growth that is kind of a composite metric that comes out at the end of the process. Once they've decided what their land use and transportation plans are going to be, they run their models, and VMT is this composite metric. It's an output of that process. So if you look today, you would say that basically these general plans, these regional transportation plans, already have a VMT threshold baked into them. And the question before you is whether or not they need additional guidance on how to set a threshold that would influence all the way down to the individual project level and take into consideration either A, the state's position on this particular topic. Does the state have a specific reason why they would have a standard that they would want to apply? And two, whether or not local agencies, when they develop their general plans, is there something they should be thinking about that maybe they haven't that's really important as it relates to the points Jeff was making about the need for VMT reduction? A lot of the modeling that is done for general plans as well as these regional plans do not take into direct account transportation demand management actions. There's a lot more you could do to reduce VMT if you implement those. And that's something that maybe hasn't been fully thought out at the local or even at the regional level. So to the extent that we're trying to draw thresholds, I think it's important to understand what thresholds actually are kind of baked into the plans we've already adopted, and then whether or not you want to induce new thresholds, and if you're going to introduce those, under what basis are you going to introduce them?
Mm-hmm. Amanda, and then Terry?
Yeah, so we have a couple of concerns about this average threshold. Certainly, SB743 is very clearly trying to pull down the region's average greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled per capita. So if these guidelines, by contrast, say, no, average is good enough, average is good, that could, I could make an argument that could be seen as undermining SB375, potentially, because if we approve a lot of development at average, we're actually not doing a great job of pulling down the region's average. I'd also ask a question is what is that, on what science is that average proposed threshold or significance criteria based? And I'd like to see where that comes out in light of Jeff's conversation about climate. But I also just think the message is problematic. California is leading the world in tackling climate change. SB743 is implementing SB375, so that finds ourselves smack in the middle of the policy conversation on climate change. And so if the guidance from the California Office of Planning Research is strive for mediocrity, average is good enough, it seems like we're ignoring the bigger picture on climate change, which is that we need to take ambitious action. So I would want to continue the idea that Jeff put forward, that we should have a larger kind of conversation about what it will take to reach our more ambitious climate goals and tie that threshold to reaching that target. And we might even examine something like a phased process where we could start with average, but there would be a recognition that to reach our 2050 goals, we're going to need to do a lot better on VMT reduction. So we might want to even ratchet down the threshold over time, more consistent with the climate science.
Yeah, so the proposal does suggest regional average, so I'd be curious what the panel has to say about other options OPR should consider. So Terry, then Jeff?
All right, well, Ron is speaking my language as a planner. I love the idea that general plans, which we already look to for thresholds under CEQA, be an obvious source. And this morning, of course, I started furtively looking at newly adopted general plans to see if there was any example I could give today. I should have called Ron. I think we should start there because I think we may have already cracked this code. And it doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be some instruction and guidance, especially for communities that are going to or are already updating their general plans or CERC elements that can actually solve the problem there. And I'm looking down the table here to see if San Francisco, Victoria, has anything to say about this, because I'm guessing that you've been thinking about this too as you've already dived into the idea of using VMT as the metric.
We sure have, and we are in the process of beginning of an update to our transportation element of the general plan, although we have quite a ways to go. Just to get back to the original question of whether it's helpful, the guidance, and yes, the city and I think other people have found it helpful. That being said, though, I do think that the lead agency should have the discretion to set the ultimate threshold. Now, in doing so, the lead agency needs to have substantial evidence in setting that threshold, and that's where I get back to some of the comments made by Ron and Jeff, where in that presenting that substantial evidence, we rely on the underlying intent of the existing legislation, on perhaps something coming out of the Air Resources Board, on SCS. For example, our Big Plan Bay Area 1 sets thresholds of VMT reduction of 10%, for instance, and even with implementation of SCS, we don't quite reach that, by the way. So as a city in San Francisco, as a city county, we'd like to reserve the right to set that threshold and couch that threshold within the legislative intent and within the larger conversation that people here have alluded to, precisely to get to Amanda's point about reaching for a higher target, because we really need to do better than the regional average. And San Francisco does better already, quite a bit so, but probably to accommodate all the infill growth that we are taking, we need to do more.
So Jeff, yeah.
There are some fabulous general plans out there that have great per capita VMT reduction goals, and there are some general plans that are not so great. So what I would suggest is that there are several sources of baseline information that we could look to. One would be the expected average VMT for new development in municipal general plans. Two would be the county or regional average. Three would be any goal that CARB might establish in the future. And four would be the SCS. And that until CARB or somebody else establishes very specific targets, I would simply put forward that if the project is 15% below the VMT rate of any of those above mentioned baselines, you're good to go. And that it's pretty much, we're regularly called upon to cut VMT by as much as 40%. So pretty much any development project, including projects in rural California that are small, can adjust their per capita VMT by about 15%. That's a reasonable stretch, but not an onerous stretch for most development projects. I think that would be a reasonable place to start until we're able to develop more refined guidance for specific jurisdictions throughout the state in order to meet the larger goal. I would also say, to Victoria's point, that we should delegate to local jurisdictions the ability to set targets however they like within their jurisdiction, provided that in the end they still get to this 15% below where we are now goal. 15, yeah, or better.
Okay, great. If anyone from the audience has specific questions, and also you can see on the screen, those of you who are watching this webcast can email questions, and Greg will give me a sign if there's one on. Okay, thank you.
Can I respond to this one too?
Yeah, so yeah, if there's anything specifically on thresholds, please feel free to jump in and go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think it's good that there are no thresholds baked into this proposed regulation. I think in general, state-imposed thresholds are potentially problematic simply because of the great diversity of the state, the 58 counties, the 475 cities, whatever we have. I do think at the end of the day, lead agencies need significance criteria in order to write their environmental documents. And I remember the experience of the rollout of the SB7 regulations and the big debate about whether they would include a threshold of significance. And one school of thought was that the local agencies had no clue what to do on their own, and they really wanted a statewide threshold of significance for GHG emissions. But I think the state wisely chose not to do that. But what I would suggest, for what little it's worth, that you might do here would be to not include thresholds in this regulation, but to write OPR advisory documents where you can give guidance to local governments about how they might develop their own thresholds and possibly address multiple different types of circumstances. From a defense standpoint in terms of CEQA litigation, I always think that if you follow those advisory recommendations, you almost get the benefit of a safe harbor, because you can say, Your Honor, this is what the state's recommending, and if we do it, shouldn't that be good enough? But because they're not mandatory, you don't have to follow them, and you don't get sued for not following them. So this would be a way for the state to provide very helpful guidance on a very complicated subject without trying to do a one-size-fits-all threshold at the state level, and then giving help where it's needed at the local level.
So I'm looking over at the Chris's. If you guys want to jump in at any time, my back is to you. So.
Well, just really briefly, Jim raised a really good point about the different places we could put some of this guidance. Our proposal addresses the CEQA guidelines, which is the regulatory text, but we do have the flexibility to maybe augment some of that in a technical advisory. So keep that in mind as we make our comments.
And Kurt?
Kate, for what it's worth, and I respect all these opinions, they're all good ones. Our little one example of a project, if we had some sort of a guideline of 15% reduction in VMT, we would qualify, and I would have gotten out of a 138-page traffic document.
Nice. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Ron?
Yeah, in terms of providing guidance, especially, I want to make it really clear the difference between the discretion lead agencies have and the state weighing in on that. So if the state doesn't weigh in, lead agencies have the discretion, and they'll largely base it on their general plan. At least for the cities and counties. For regional agencies or others, they'll have to come up with something else. But it would, I think, be important to reinforce what we have in general plan law to recognize if you're going to step in and the state's going to provide a threshold, it's very clear what that's based on, because if the state chooses a threshold that's inconsistent with local general plans, then you're going to put local agencies in the position of them looking at this environmental impact and literally having to override it because it's inconsistent with their general plan. So we kind of have this little tug-of-war, if you will, between the state and the local agencies. I think it's reasonable for the state to declare that environmental objective is important, and it's also okay for them to identify a particular threshold if it's well-grounded in something. And to the extent that it's not grounded, it really puts the lead agencies, cities and counties, in this awkward position that they could be identifying impacts under CEQA and just overriding them because they're completely inconsistent with their general plan. So I think you want to avoid that particular situation unless you have this very clear evidence as to the state has a particular position on this metric and a threshold. And we have some precedent in transportation for that now. Caltrans has its own level of service thresholds for the state highway system. Sometimes that state highway system is the main street for a community, and we have to deal with that doing our transportation impact studies. Sometimes we look at both thresholds and do the analysis both ways to make it clear what the trade-offs are, but ultimately the lead agency gets to decide what they're going to do. So I do think there's a real difference here between what the state does versus what's baked into these existing general plans. The other thing I'll clarify in terms of if the state were to set a reduction goal and we're looking for evidence other than AB 32 and SB 375. There is research out there. Some of it's baked into the California Air Pollution Control Officers Association greenhouse gas mitigation document, and it does suggest that there are different levels of VMT reduction based on your physical proximity, whether you're downtown in San Francisco versus out in a suburban area. So to the extent that you're looking for guidance, that document does provide a stratification of potential levels of reasonable VMT reduction. There's also research that came out this year from UC Davis. They have a VMT impact tool that looks at the marginal effects on VMT, and that also looks at, I think, 7 different neighborhood types and shows you how VMT can scale in terms of the reduction potential based on neighborhood type. So I think we could look to some of that existing research as a basis.
Great. I'm going to move us to our third, and I think it'll probably be our final topic that we have time for, mitigation. And so this question is really about the proposal setting a list of examples of mitigation measures. And so the question is this list helpful? Do the examples need to be listed in Appendix F? Would the same purpose be served by listing in a technical advisory? That just came up a minute ago, that idea. But if you want to look at the examples of mitigation measures, they're listed in as an amendment to Appendix F, and there's a whole long list of them, including potential measures to reduce VMT, improving and increasing access to transit, increasing access to common goods and services such as grocery stores, schools, daycare, incorporating affordable housing, improving the jobs housing fit, goes on and on. There's quite a list. So the question for the panel, is this a good list? Is it helpful? What are we missing? Anybody? Amanda, yeah.
Yeah, so I think somewhere, I think we could all agree, well, I won't speak for, I'll speak for myself. I think it's helpful for the state to provide some guidance on best practices that can reduce VMT. So I think that is a helpful tool as we're talking about changing this transportation analysis framework paradigm from LOS to VMT, to provide some, for project developers and local governments, some listing on the best projects to reduce, or best strategies to reduce VMT. But I'm also very sensitive to and aware of concerns about creating additional litigation risk as a result of this change. And I think we should all strive to minimize litigation risk by being as strategic as we can with how we implement this. So if there's a consideration that placing these mitigation measures in an advisory as opposed to in the regulatory portion of the guidelines would help to minimize litigation risk, I think that would be a good decision.
Okay, anybody else on mitigation? Terry?
Okay. Well,
She said exactly what I was going to say.
Oh.
Put him in an advisory.
So I think
okay.
Jim needs to go next, just to tee you up. So there's another place we could put good advice, friendly advice to cities and counties, and that would be the general plan guidelines update. And I think we ought to consider that as another place to put ideas that can move the ball that don't have any kind of backlash or even relationship directly to 743.
Okay, Jeff?
Please don't put these in the guidelines. Put them in a technical advisory memo where you can provide additional information about the utility of each. What I don't want is some poor judge demanding that a project adopt a transportation demand management program that doesn't make any sense for that project, or one that has very limited benefit. And you know, this stuff is important, but it requires more detail than is here, and I think would be a better fit in a side document.
Mm-hmm. Eric, yeah.
From my point of view as a transportation engineer, you know, I think the examples are fine. I don't mind having those in there. I don't mind if they're taken out. I don't really have strong preferences on which document they're put into, as long as, you know, I think if they're out in the public, then people can look at them from a transportation engineer's point of view again. What I'm most interested in is looking at examples of specific projects and specific mitigations. And if you have this type of project and you have this type of mitigation and it reduces the VMT by this much, and you either do or do not mitigate your VMT impacts, does that make sense? And not just for one project, but for many projects.
Great, thank you. Ron?
I also think that a technical advisory would be more useful, but I'll also go so far as, and I have a lot of requests like this for OPR, could we make it digital? I mean, we're talking about resource and technical information here that the subject matter will only continue to expand over time. We'll get better information, better data. It'd be nice if there was a wiki-like repository at OPR for this kind of information, such that it stays, viable over time and we can update it, versus something that becomes a one-time technical document. And one of the concerns I have about some of the, some of those type of, printed one time is they get, baked into the legal process, and lawyers continue to use them even 10 years after they're out of date, and we're stuck with them because they've been, reviewed in a court case and someone accepted them 10 years ago. So if there was a way to keep the data more current, more up to date in a digital format through a wiki-like resource, that would be advantageous.
Right. Victoria?
That's a really good suggestion. I would say that the listing of the measures is in fact helpful, and I think they're appropriately coming from the KEPCOA document. I do, however, strongly feel that they should also be in the advisory for all the reasons that have been articulated before. And sorry, I lost my train of thought.
All right, that's okay. So yeah, it seems like there's a lot of consensus, at least on this panel, about moving them out of the regulations and into technical advisory. So for you guys to think about.
I remember.
Oh, Victoria, go ahead.
To Eric's point, we are quite interested actually in figuring out the efficacy of these mitigation measures, and San Francisco is working to continue the work that has been done by KEPCOA and Fair and Peers to try to figure out their efficacy specifically in urban environments to see how well they work.
Great. Yeah, I'm working with another hat with the Strategic Growth Council on our Cap and Trade Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities program, and we're just in the thick of what is going to be the methodology we're going to work with ARB on to determine the benefits of the projects that will be proposed. And you look through this list of mitigation measures, these are the kinds of projects where we're looking to fund through that program. And so there's going to be a lot of evolution on how these different measures interact and benefit VMT reduction. So there's just a broad range of options, not just one strategy or the other. Yeah, Terry?
So having heard a lot of concern from my friends in rural areas that feel left out, I was doing some research on what does reduce VMT in rural areas, rural projects, smaller towns, even suburban areas. And so somebody mentioned the idea of the sort of project-specific or project-type list and what does reduce. It does turn out that you can reduce VMT in rural and even suburban areas, and there's some really good methods, but they're not the same as in San Francisco. And so I think some sort of advisory plus the general plan guidelines update and some model approaches would be really, really useful.
Okay. Anybody else on mitigation on this list? Or? Okay.
I would just add that when I see the list, it reminds me of a very obscure law that is honored mainly in the breach. It's a 1995 legislation that's resulted in Health and Safety Code 40717.9, which basically says that it's against the law for any public agency in California to impose employee trip reduction programs on new development unless it's required by federal law or you lose your highway funding. And I've been aware of this law for 20 years, and I've just seen it ignored. But one of my obsessions is just anytime I'm in front of someone who has the ear of the legislature or the governor to remind them that it just is getting in the way of climate-related policies, and maybe this should be the session where it's just repealed. So next time you're hanging out with the governor or the pro tem or Speaker of Assembly, you might just remind them that that law is on the books, and there's some of these items here that arguably would run afoul of that statute.
All right. Up next, maybe. Ron?
Yeah, since Jim brought that up, one of the questions we have on that particular law is it references the employer versus the developer. We've made recommendations in EIRs that the developer is the one responsible, or the project applicant, versus the employer. Does that help at all, or are we still stuck with the same problem?
You know, I checked yesterday. There's been no litigation, no in-court interpretation of this section, so I don't know whether that would fly. I'd favor just repeal myself.
Okay. I will open it up now. We do have one more topic if we have time to get to it, but I think I'll open it up for anything specifically on mitigation, or also at this time we're open to general comments or questions from the audience. If you're watching the webcast, you can email the address on your screen. And anybody would like to weigh in here? Sir?
My name is Mark Perlberger. In particular, Ron, you were mentioning case studies and work on case studies. I'm wondering if there are any case studies either on projects that already exist or went through a process, or else anything that you're just kind of making up to try and see how this would work, that would be available for people to peruse.
I have one set of, I think, excellent case studies that you can take a look at, which is the program called Green Trip. It's sponsored by Transform, so I believe it's transform.org or transformca.org. And their program, Green Trip, has been going for about 6 years, and basically it's a certification program. Similar to LEED, how you can certify, this is certifying projects that are actually reducing VMT, and they're using, they've been using a series of models to calculate that, and various factors, on-model, off-model factors that are projects, infill projects that are reducing VMT. So that's, I think, a good set of case studies. That's, I don't know, a dozen or two projects.
Kate, I can embellish on that.
Okay, yeah, Kurt, and then
I'm on the board of Transform, but also on the committee for Green Trip,
okay. Yeah, go ahead.
and it's a marvelous undertaking. It's had such good response. There are dozens and dozens of projects now that are taking advantage of it because it's politically very useful to go in and show that you're actually taking some effort to reduce your VMT. So I would encourage everybody to check that website out, and you'll.
Well, and just a quick follow-up to part of what I look at is not just the efficacy and the ability to measure the reduction in VMT, but some kind of analysis potentially on, you know, how it's different than projects today and what it costs to accomplish the goals different than today.
Yeah, the Green Trip project has costs in it,
Yeah.
so cost analysis is included.
Yeah. So Ron, then Terry?
Yeah, so we've provided case study examples to OPR and also to Eric, the IT task force. And we have a variety of others depending on what your specific circumstance might be, including some of the rural projects that some folks have been interested in. As to a couple that you may want to look at in terms of like a general plan example, Yolo County general plan has a VMT threshold in it, and it actually applies to new growth specific plan areas. I was one of the first in the state to actually take that particular approach. So if you want to see how one was put together in terms of a general plan, that's a good example. But feel free to contact me for others if you have a specific type of project in mind.
Right. Terry?
Well, I just wanted to turn it around since I know this gentleman's in the development business. And it would be great, I will send you an email. If you have ideas for real projects we had to put through the how would it work screen, we'd love to hear them.
Great, thanks. Amanda?
Yeah, and I would just add in, Kate referenced LEED. Of course, NRDC was a co-sponsor of LEED for neighborhood development, LEED ND, which is a detailed rating system for smart growth developments. And so this kind of goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about should transit proximity alone be counted on to give you a low VMT project, or are there other factors you should consider? And LEED ND goes through carefully and considers density, diversity of land uses, parking, a number of other factors. So that could start to give you a sense of the breadth of strategies to actually reduce VMT.
Anything else on case studies to answer the gentleman's question? Okay. Are there other questions from the audience? Okay. We hear it online? Okay. Okay. We do have one other topic since we do have a little extra time, which is focusing on the safety component of the regulations. So the question here is, well, first of all, do we need to include any guidance on safety in this section? And if so, did our list hit the right factors? So if you look at the draft regulations on safety, it includes examples of factors that might be relevant, like increased exposure of bicyclists and pedestrians in vehicle conflict areas, B, contributing to queuing on freeway off-ramps where queues extend onto the main line. C, contribute to speed differentials of greater than 15 miles per hour between adjacent travel lanes, and several other things. So how is this list? Should we include it at all? How should we be thinking about safety? So Jeff, and then Eric?
I can't believe that I'm actually arguing against safety, but I think it's a big problem to include safety in CEQA. And let me try to describe why. So it's very easy to measure safety after the fact. It's quite difficult to predict in advance. And most importantly, in our industry, particularly right now, there are no generally agreed upon criteria that enhance safety. In fact, there's a great debate happening right now with radically different design approaches. And perhaps they are epitomized by the Caltrans Highway Design Manual versus the National Association of City Transportation Officials Urban Street Design Guide. These street design documents take very different approaches towards safety. And one can reasonably argue that the California Highway Design Manual is the best state of the practice in terms of safe design for rural highways, whereas the NACDO Urban Street Design Guide is perhaps the best state of the practice for urban streets. The trouble is, there are places where one is adopted and not the other. There's also context zones that are quite in between. And you can get a highly professional, really, really heavily credentialed traffic engineer to argue one or the other regardless of context. So the problem here is if our goal is to reduce unnecessary, unproductive litigation under CEQA, this chapter, this section, significantly worsens conditions for basically about any project, particularly given the specific examples of safety problems that are listed. So, for example, increased exposure in conflict areas is something that we do as a matter of course in traffic calming projects. So if you're reducing speed, you may actually be increasing conflict, but the result will be an improvement of safety. A fixed standard that says conflict equals safety may work in some conditions, but not in all conditions. What's even worse is queuing traffic onto the main line of a freeway. Granted, queuing traffic onto the main line of a freeway, bad for safety. Every single urban area in California, however, has freeway off-ramps that back up onto the main line during peak. And therefore, any urban project that generates a single vehicle trip can be assumed to be exacerbating the freeway queuing problem. And then in order to mitigate that, the only thing that they'll be able to do is widen the intersections at the end of the freeway off-ramp. So we've taken LOS out with one hand and shoved it right back in on the other hand, making all urban development projects in places where there's existing freeway congestion suspect. So as much as it pains me to do this, I would argue that safety needs to be removed from CEQA, otherwise we're going to be facing even worse unintended negative consequences as we did with level of service.
Okay, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you in 1 second, but I have to defend myself and the recent work of Caltrans to endorse the NACDO guidelines that Jeff mentioned this spring. So we are actively encouraging cities and Caltrans employees and engineers to utilize those guidelines in urban areas. So first, okay, go ahead, Eric.
Okay, my comments are gonna go in a little bit different direction, but just thinking about first of all, whether safety should be an environmental impact at all. I think you could argue that roadway capacity and level of service may not be an environmental impact depending on your definition of the environment. I think those same arguments could be used for VMT, which we're now considering, or safety. But I think as long as VMT and a whole host of other things are included in CEQA, then I think safety is something that should be included. With respect to these guidelines themselves, I think that all I need to know as a transportation engineer is that safety is something that should be considered as an environmental impact, and I think that's in the legislation. And so what I would say is it's there, that's all that needs to be said. I would, examples are fine, I don't have a problem with examples, but I think that safety is such a case-by-case, site-specific kind of a topic that you need to go into each location and each specific situation and study it and come up with a decision based on that situation. I am sympathetic to the argument that you know, any congestion is a potential safety issue, but I don't think that traffic engineers are going to use that to then say all congestion is an impact and then you know, go back to the situation we have right now.
Okay, anyone else on the safety issue? Guidance?
Let me, if I may, just
Yeah.
clarify. What the statute says about safety is that nothing in this statute relieves a lead agency of the responsibility to analyze transportation-related impacts such as air quality, noise, and safety. So the question that we face is, given that that isn't removed from CEQA, is it helpful for OPR to put something into the guidelines that addresses safety, or should we remain silent on the issue?
I was going to note that the statute does read as though safety is a legitimate CEQA issue, whether it was before or not. So it seems like it is based on this language. I thought this list looked okay until I heard Jeff talk about what a disastrous list it was. So he persuaded me that maybe this list shouldn't be in the regulation. And I returned to my mantra of, you know, putting good stuff in an advisory document, maybe constantly updated like a wiki if you have that much spare time. I do think that local governments and their constituents are interested in the topic, because I can't tell you how many times I've been in a public hearing where some neighbor basically says that because the project at issue is going to make traffic worse, there will be more accidents and people will die and there's blood in the hands of the developer. And it always seems to be like a line they think is just going to bring the house down. And it's clear that there's views in some quarters that one traffic accident on a well-designed road is an unacceptable safety impact. And if it's true, as I think, that we all take the risk of getting in cars all the time, and we put our kids in cars and we're risking their lives all the time, there will be accidents even on very well-designed roads. And to the extent that these people in public hearings can be disabused of the notion that any traffic results in death and therefore unacceptable safety impacts, that would, to me, be a good thing.
Okay, Ron and then Jeff. Oh, Kurt, did you want to jump in too?
All I was going to say was, to me, safety, number one, is pedestrians and bicyclists ahead of cars, because once we get people out of cars into transit, then that starts to take care of itself.
All right, Ron?
Yeah, so Chris Calvi kind of asked the question of whether or not OPR is in a better position to be silent on this versus provide some guidance. Being silent on it means lead agencies will have to decide for themselves what is an appropriate set of factors and thresholds. And this is not a simple subject. Not only do you have the issues that Jeff Tumlin mentioned in terms of different sets of practices, if you will, different approaches to the fundamental question of design for safety. You have the trade-off between modes that Kurt just mentioned. And then further, you also get this tangled up with other legal issues around safety, tort liability, for example. And a number of lead agencies we've worked with have always been concerned about acknowledging whether or not something was safe or unsafe, and how are you making that determination, because it could have implications for their tort liability protection when designing and constructing roadways or other transportation facilities. So I don't think this is a simple topic, and I think you have to be very careful that any guidance you provide potentially sets up projects that you could literally, for every project in the state that comes forward, development or transportation, could have the potential to exacerbate a safety problem requiring an EIR and not being able to do a neg deck. So this is a very challenging subject area, and with the time that OPR had to write guidance, I don't think that was a reasonable amount of time to try and tackle this particular issue. Being silent on it in this version of the guidelines to allow lead agencies to continue to refine their practices, especially in light of new design guidance from NACTO and others, may be the best thing to do while you take this on in the next round, maybe, to see if there's some common area of technical agreement amongst experts about how you would tackle safety problems in the CEQA context.
Jeff, yeah.
So if there was a desire to put something in the guidelines, what I would suggest is that, as Kurt suggested, that we reference some specific factors. One factor would be safety, particularly for vulnerable users, particularly cyclists and pedestrians. And not specify how, but set a higher standard for focusing on safety for vulnerable users. Use of the most current roadway design guidelines for the available context would be something else you might want to be specific about that would provide enough flexibility, but also help address the potential conflict between different design documents, and the courts assuming that the more highway-oriented design guidance is the more conservative and therefore safer document. Similarly, motor vehicle speed has a very strong correlation with safety outcomes, and you could suggest that speed might be something that warrants study and analysis. But then, just as we discussed with TDM, with transportation demand management, take this complex discussion out of the guidelines themselves and produce a technical accompaniment that would provide additional detail about how to achieve the optimal safety outcomes in different contexts, just as we're trying to achieve the optimal VMT reduction for different contexts as well. And that could be, in fact, I think Deputy Secretary Kate White would be a fantastic person for developing guidelines for the state and that topic.
I can see there's a lot of technical advice papers coming our way. Okay, anything else on safety?
I guess that I will just throw a lead agency perspective on it. I couldn't agree with you more, Jeff. You said it so eloquently. We would prefer OPR to remain silent in the draft guidelines on this particular issue, most certainly. A technical advisory would be great, but we would like a collaborative effort in crafting what that looks like, because it is so context specific, and in many, many situations, to your point, Eric, the traffic engineer is the best judge, or the planning person, or whoever.
I have a question for Terry, if I may. Oh, I'm sorry, Amanda.
Just one more comment, just to note that the types of interventions that will improve safety for cyclists and pedestrians might be in direct conflict with the type of safety improvements you might want to make for automobile users. So safety is complex and very subjective. And I also just wanted to highlight, because we didn't get to talk about the presumption of lessened significance for certain types of transportation projects. We talked about land use projects, but there is a note in here that transportation projects that are for the primary purpose of improving safety are presumed to be less than significant. And that's just something we want to weigh in and clarify. We're also not comfortable with, because who defines what the primary purpose of a project is, and is that project advancing the safety of motorists? Is it advancing the safety of other users of the system? So that seems like a complex gray area that we need a little bit more detail on before making a blanket presumption like that.
Was there?
Thank you, Kate. Terry, if all these technical advisory documents come out and they have all these wonderful recommendations, can't cities take them and include them in their general plans when they update them?
Oh, sure. I mean, technical advisories are a great place to put anything and suggest in them how you might apply the principles or the best practices in your general plans or other documents.
I think a lot of us would be willing to advocate for that for cities.
Well, and it sounds like there's enough that might go in a technical advisory for this particular set of guidelines that it might merit its own technical advisory. But I think it's a great idea with some redundancy with the general plan update guidelines.
Okay. Anything else from the audience? There was another question over here.
I'm Tom Pace from the city of Sacramento, and I'd like to echo what Jeff Tumlin said as well. I'd like for safety to not be prescribed in the regulations, and if they do have to be, that perhaps something can be said that things like queuing on ramps isn't a safety consideration, or you can't undermine the purpose of these guidelines changes in terms of getting away from congestion by reintroducing congestion in the guise of a safety criterion. Downtown development here in Sacramento happens to be in an area where there's a lot of freeway congestion and a ring of freeways around downtown, and freeway ramps have impacts, and there are also speed differentials on the main line, and so these specific
proposed guidelines put infill development in downtown at risk by having agencies request more mitigation or more costly expenditures that make infill development less feasible.
Thank you. Any response to that from the panelists? Okay. Anything else from the audience? Any other questions or comments? Okay, I'll kick it back to the panel if there's any final comments or observations, things you learned or are going to take away. I wrote down a whole bunch of things, but and also for OPR, if there's any major responses. Yeah, go ahead, Eric.
I've been in many discussions like this, and I'm struck by how we're talking about this at a very high level, and I'm looking forward to rolling up our sleeves and getting into the details of how this would work.
All right, next workshop. Anyone else? Great. I want to thank the panelists very much for your time and your intelligence and input, and thank the audience both online and in the room for joining us today, and again thank OPR for their leadership on this important law.
Yeah, thank you so much for moderating, Kate, and thank you to our panelists for joining us today. Just a couple of closing thoughts from my perspective. First of all, I hope that you all, well, I'll say that I heard a lot of difficult issues. I will admit that I don't have an answer to these issues yet, and I hope that the observers have an appreciation for some of the difficult issues that we're grappling with. I hope this discussion also illustrates that our hope is to be very transparent about some of the conflicts that we see in this process and some of the policy choices that need to be made. And I also hope that this is given, I heard a lot of very specific suggestions come out of the panel discussion, and I hope that sparks some thinking amongst the observers in providing us comments. So we do look forward to everyone's comments by November 21st. Email is the very best way to do that. That's sequa.guidelines@ceres.ca.gov. So thank you very much for being here. Thanks. Have a good afternoon.